gotten me so upset. Tennessee made me lose my rest, and everybody knows about Mississippi. Goddamn! This is a show tune, but the show hasn't been...
Actually, I cut her off at the wrong time. I should have let her talk about how she's making this a show tune, but you can go YouTube this later and listen to the rest of the song. The fact that she's singing Mississippi Goddamn is just amazing. So I want to do a little bit of background on how this event happened, and then I want to kind of do maybe a minute or two on what I'd like to do for rules, because I want to do rules at this event, and then I'm going to pass this on to the speakers. And only one of them actually sent me their bio, so I'm not going to introduce them. I'm going to make them introduce themselves.
That is true.
And it could be, they'll probably just do like one sentence intro sort of thing. So first of all, this was actually, this is technically not an Austin School event, although since the other people aren't here and Austin School did all the organizing, we've turned it into, we sort of hijacked this and turned it into an Austin School event. The original impetus behind it was that the ACC got an endowment to hold a series of events based on a book, and
have you read the book?
I have not read the book. No, I don't have a copy of the book either. So, and we've just sort of been, after they created the event, they sort of abandoned us and left us to our own devices. So if this doesn't go exactly as they had intended, it's their fault. But what ended up happening was I put out sort of an appeal to various different people to be on the panel, and these were the three people who were willing to sacrifice to be on the panel. Nobody wanted to do it, and we didn't actually, when we started this, even though it was going to be a racism panel, I didn't envision it being necessarily an African-American racism panel. Like I thought we'd have a Hispanic and maybe an Asian, and that it'd be sort of a conversation. And the Austin School met last week, and one of the things that we talked about was we would do this as sort of an African-American race panel, and then the next one would be maybe Hispanic racism, and then the last one might be Asian or maybe Muslim or both, or maybe...
The last one should be a white, because
Oh.
white is a race.
Right, we could do a
It's not
white
just black
racism panel. Yeah, okay, so we might have 4. I think Frank is volunteering to do that one. We're gonna
Moderate.
yeah, Frank, please moderate. Oh my God, actually I know the panel we're putting on. So it sort of ended up growing into this. Technically speaking, 3.5 of the panelists up here have African blood, and so it will still have this sort of African theme going. But I think we're all going to come at this in a very different direction, at least I suspect. No, from what I know of my other 3 panelists, it should be a little different. And what I want to do is I want to have each person sort of talk 15 minutes, give or take 5 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A, but I kind of want it to be as conversational as possible. And here's the ground rule that I want you to take into this. I want you to just assume that everybody has good intentions. That may not be true, of course, but let's just go ahead and go with that assumption. And so if you find yourself getting emotional, because this is an emotional topic, I think it's worthwhile checking in why you're getting emotional, right? Like if somebody said something and it's just got you ramped up, it's entirely possible that they've said something that's true, and that's why you're upset. And so what I want you to do is just assume that they have good intentions, whether it's one of the panelists or one of the people in the audience, and then go from there, right? So you feel free to call us out on something that you don't like, but I'm learning this new thing called call in. And so feel free to do that, but also remember that our goal here is not to perpetuate the things that divide us. Our goal here is to somehow erode some of those divisions, which is of course not easy. We've been working on this for how many centuries now, and depending on what stats you look at, we haven't made much progress. Anyway, I can't think of anything else I want to say about that, so why don't we turn it over to Dante, and did you want to jump in?
No.
Okay, we'll turn it over to Dante, and Dante will start.
So my 15 minutes away? Awesome.
I'm gonna time you.
Okay, I was gonna time myself. But
No,
that's
go
cool.
for it. Go.
First of all, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I love coming to do panels. I just love the discussion that happens, especially when we get to the Q&A piece. So a little bit about myself. My name is Dante Houston. I'm an Austinite, and I spent 5 years in the Marine Corps as an intelligence non-commissioned officer. And then after that, I had the pleasure of being a student of Dr. Casagranda here and his wife, call her Dr. M. And both of them have taught me a lot of great things, and I think it's going to be a big impact on what I talk about here today. The thing that's weird to me about America, and I've been in other countries, is that how well we are at living within our own bubbles. We're very good at living with each other, but not really with each other. I actually, remember growing up right across the street here in these projects. I didn't live here, my grandmother did, and my parents and my grandfather would take me here all the time. And, this before I really understood, who I was and what my skin meant to society. I just remember it just being a fun time. Now that I'm older and I'm able to look back, I can see that maybe for my parents or for my grandparents, it maybe wasn't always fun. But they did a really good job of just trying to raise us to be happy. Growing up in East Austin, and the part of the time that I spent in Southwest Houston, I just remember not knowing that I was really different outside of what my parents would tell me when I would go home. When I was out with my friends, we would always have a really good time, but the discussions that always happened whenever I came home was that, hey, you may feel comfortable in your neighborhood, but understand that the things that are happening outside of our neighborhood, and sometimes in our neighborhood whenever we're being heavily policed, are not something that's gonna, you're gonna understand immediately when you see it. It wasn't until it's not, as an African American or a black person in society, you notice these things as you get older. It isn't something that just happens immediately. One day you realize that a teacher is treating you differently than another student. One day you realize that, you can be accused of something that you didn't do, and it's more easy for the adults in the room to believe that you actually did it when you didn't, just based off how you look. And you can think to another scenario where another student got the benefit of the doubt. You can join the military and think that, hey, by serving, I'm going to be finally treated as everybody else, and then you just really realize that everybody around you came from different backgrounds, and the way they see you is not the way that you view yourself. And when you start to realize your place in society, you have two ways of dealing with it. You could ignore it, but even then emotionally you just can't. Or you can be very angry and you lash out. And there's stereotypes for both of those kinds of people, right? The person that ignores it and acts like it doesn't exist is the person that isn't woke, or the person that's an Uncle Tom, or whatever the case is, right? That person is still suffering. And then the person that's angry, right? That's angry about the situation and lashes out against some of the actions taken against them is deemed the angry minority, the angry black woman, the angry black man, right? So there's no winning in this situation whenever you're dealing with those microaggressions. I haven't really decided which person I am in that situation, because as I just explained to you, neither one allows you to be free as a human being, right? Assimilation, right, to me is asking someone to be invisible. Hey, we need you to be like everybody else. Although we will never see you like everybody else, we need you to act like everybody else the best way you can. And you can never do that because you come from a different background. You can't ignore when you see the news stories about people like Trayvon Martin or Mike Brown, or even what we saw with the gentlemen that were in the Starbucks. You start to ask yourself, as a black person, where in this world can I go where I won't be judged by my skin tone? And the answer, for as long as I've lived on this earth, which is 28 years now, is that there isn't a place where a black person can go and won't feel that kind of anxiety or that kind of pressure to live beyond their skin, as if it's something that they have to do. So I'm gonna cut my time short because I'm really interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say. But you want me to go? I really do want to hear the experiences of not only the people on this panel, but of maybe the students in the crowd, because this is the discussion that we keep having, and we're going to have to keep having, because it's not something that's going to go away anytime soon.
Well, hi, I am Shannon Sinegal. I am not from Texas, I'm from Louisiana. And I want to talk to you a little bit about racism in schools. Since I grew up in Louisiana, I mostly attended majority Anglo schools. So I was always the one person that kind of stood out. And I wasn't dark enough, and I wasn't light enough, and I have green eyes. So I was picked on a lot. Are you really African American? Are you Anglo? Or am I mixed? So I always kind of stood out. And plus I was also, I guess, a little smarty pants, I guess. And I was in honors classes. And I, most times, was the only one there. And I felt like I always had to work twice as hard. I had to do more work than any of my other peers, even though we had the same assignments. And it didn't get better, not even when I went to grad school. Once I went to grad school, it seems like it only intensified the fact that I had to work twice as hard as everyone else. But my story is not alone. If we look at schools all over this country, racism is still an issue. Even though we went through Jim Crow and we had the Brown decision, and the Brown decision was in 1954, and in 1955 it was rediscussed again, and the Supreme Court said that we had to integrate the schools. But it wasn't until really the 1970s where we start to bus kids to try to achieve this racially mixed balance. And we are still having issues. The area that I'm from, like I said, from Louisiana, we have 6 high schools, and one high school has a predominantly African American population, and they are constantly busing kids anywhere from 30 miles to 40 miles to try to achieve racially balance. Last year, Jon Stewart did a discussion where he actually, I'm sorry, not Jon Stewart, John Oliver, he looked at school segregation, and he made up some really interesting points that we still have issues with school segregation, and we mostly see it at least in the northern areas, the northern states. And it's not by law, but it's mostly where African Americans tend to live. African Americans and other minorities, they tend to live near each other. And because they live near each other, they live in areas which they could afford. They have to attend those schools. And if they attend a majority African American or majority Hispanic school, usually those schools receive less funding. Their teachers are not as senior as, say, another school. Usually they'll have newer teachers, and these teachers usually have less experience, and they don't have that same access or that same knowledge as other senior teachers have. Also, technology is lacking. If we would go into majority Anglo school, they may have like new books, they may have iPads, they may have a really good football team, especially if you're in Texas. But then if you go to an African American school, you don't have that many computers, you don't have laptops, you don't have good teachers. Sometimes the schools, the buildings are falling apart. And what happens if you attend a school where the building is falling apart? What does that subconsciously teach you? In a way, it teaches you that you are inferior. And that's something really hard to overcome. Once somebody says that you are inferior, it's really hard to overcome that. It took me a long time for me to realize that I am not an inferior person. I am not all of those things that my teachers believed that I was. And that's something that I still struggle with. Even I have a niece and a nephew My nephew, being an African-American boy living in the South, he has faced a lot of discrimination. Just considering that he's an African-American boy, he at one point used to wear cowboy boots. And they're like, wait, you can't wear cowboy boots because you're an African-American. Okay, that's insane. Or some African-American schools have zero policies. And if an individual gets in a fight, they're likely to get suspended. And what happens if you get suspended or expelled? What do you do with yourself? Well, most of these individuals, they go to jail, or before they go to jail, they usually turn to crime because they don't have that activity like school provides them with. And we sometimes, our scholars tend to call this school to prison. And this is a big issue. I think about 15% of African Americans, especially females, are more likely to be expelled from school. And like I said, if they expel from school, where do they go? They end up most likely in prison. So I guess my question to you guys, which we'll probably get to in a bit, how do we correct this? How do we fix our education system? Should we be concerned? Or does it not even affect you? Does it not even bother you that individuals are being treated unfairly? Okay, and I'll turn it over to...
Wow, that's a lead-in. So, hello. First of all, thank you for being out here, and 5 o'clock is a weird time, and it's... Oh, I'm Frank Reid. I'm a professor here at ACC. But I wanted to say thank you first before I even introduce myself, because it's more important. So I'm a professor of management here at ACC. My background is fairly standard, which means that it's completely unstandard. If we talked about our backgrounds up here, even though we're all African Americans, our backgrounds are all different. I am a third-generation college goer. Both of my parents were doctors. Even my stepmother was a doctor. My grandfather was a doctor in Harlem. My other grandfather was a dentist in Brooklyn. Okay, my sister's a lawyer. All right, it was never a question whether or not I was going to go to school. All right, I grew up in first 10 years in a middle-class neighborhood in Chicago. It was mainly African American. The first time, and this is why I pushed, one of the reasons I pushed on Roy here, first time, well, let me just tell you the story. I came home without my sweater. My mother said, "Where's your sweater?" I said, "I gave it to Sarah." And she said, "Why?" Because Sarah was the only white girl in our school, our little preschool. And I said, "Haven't you seen her? She's sick. Something's wrong with her." I didn't realize it was just she was white. She just didn't look like the rest of us. I assumed that she was sick, that she was pale, that she must have some disease. All right, no offense, but I thought, yeah, that's what my little 4 or 5-year-old brain thought. All right, Chicago, and then when we moved to New Haven, Connecticut, which was much more, I'd call it, the neighborhood was a lower income neighborhood, middle income, but the school district was definitely a lower income school. From them, high school, college, engineer from Brown University, and my MBA from Arizona State. I tell you all that because I truly, truly hate talking about race. Absolutely hate it. My parents, they never used the words, but their attitude was, our generation took care of this. You know, your cousins went down south from New York, they were freedom riders. We got this covered. We took care of this issue. All you have to do is, ride the wave, basically. And the fact that we're still dealing with this is while it's completely obvious now that we're actually looking at it, it's also completely depressing, all right? As I said, I'm an engineer and a management kind of guy by training. I've written lots of 5-year plans. I've written lots of 3-year plans. And at the end of every one of these plans was world domination. All right? I had taken over a market. I had changed the world with our new product. You know, we had designed the next Macintosh. Something major had happened at the end of that 3 to 5 years. This ain't that kind of work. Okay? It's just, I'm going to make you say it. Sisyphean? Guy pushing
Sisyphus?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
How do you turn that into a verb?
Who knows how to turn Sisyphus into a verb?
Sisyphus?
Sisyphusian.
There we go. That sounds good. It feels never ending. So why am I talking about it now? Why did I even bother learning about this stuff? Because I did have to learn. I was not trained in this stuff. In February of 2012, I was minding my own business, and Trayvon Martin was hunted and killed. And at the time, all I could think of is, that's my son. We were living, my wife is in the back there, we were living in a gated community at the UT Golf Course up in Steiner Ranch. I was still running software companies and working here, so, you know, living the life. And I thought about my son walking around our community and someone hunting him, following him, and killing him. And that made me look. Well, first it made me scream. It made me cry. It made me different. And then I had to face the reality that it's time. It's time for me to engage and stop whining, stop complaining, and start engaging. And the more I engaged, the more I learned. The more I learned, the more frustrated I got. I learned that even here in Travis County, when my son has kids, they'll be twice as likely to die in infancy. They'll be twice as likely that their mother will die if the mother is African American. Once the kids get into kindergarten, there's a 3 to 5 times higher chance of them being suspended. Why? Because it turns out when you study kindergarten teachers, they're looking at African American kids 3 to 5 times more often for bad behavior. So every study has shown that the behaviors of the African American kid and the white kid, I'm just going to use black and white faster, black and white kids are the same. But yet they're being looked at, during playtime, they're being looked at 5 times more alike, and so they're seeing 5 times more bad behavior. All kids have bad behavior, right? So then they get suspended. Once they get suspended, then the police get called the next time, because now it's escalating, right? And then all of a sudden, as Shannon said, all of a sudden, now they've got a record. Now when they get into trouble the next time they go to jail, they miss out on their educational opportunities. All right, even if they don't end up in jail then, another way of ending up in jail is they're three times more likely to get stopped. Once they get stopped, they're 4 times more likely to get searched. And there are no stats for the difference in behavior of I'll call it the Starbucks effect, where people do the same things and are punished differently. So if someone who's white gets caught a little tipsy, or let me give you a perfect example. Walking down the street at South by Southwest, a Caucasian girl was drunk, almost falling in the street, and the police ignored her. And a black guy stepped off the curb and got yelled at by the police. So disproportionality is a major issue. So once that all happens, all of a sudden other things happen. The stress of this causes diabetes to be 4 times higher. It causes death sooner. And I think it's about 4 years sooner than the last studies that I saw. All of these things add up. And then when you add in economic discrimination, and let me touch on something you mentioned, Shannon, and that's the schools. There's two ways the differences happen. One is just by giving more money to one school. The other is something that Roy and I were talking about this afternoon, which is, I'll call it the Westlake Phenomenon, where parts of the city carve themselves out into different school systems. I worked in Allentown, Pennsylvania for a while, and all of the surrounding suburbs had pulled out of the Allentown School District, taking all of their suburban money with them and all their sales tax money with them. Okay, so schools half a mile away from each other had major different funding models. Okay, all of this, another thing that you touched on, another reason why African Americans and Hispanics tend to live together is because that's where traditionally they were forced to live. Okay. Let's keep picking on Austin because this is where I've been doing my research. It was illegal in the 1920 Austin City Plan, made it illegal for an African American west of 35, what is now 35. It wasn't even there at the time. West of 35 to receive water, electricity, any services from the city. Illegal. Think about that. Then once that happened, and it was not so, they didn't want to put it in writing, they literally encased that law in cement by putting a highway right down the middle of the red line. Let's take our Highland campus, which we are very proud of. One of the things we found when we did the research is previously it was the St. John's School for African Americans, and it also had a home for homeless children. It was on the wrong side of 35, if you remember your geography here. So they were told to sell the land. They said no. They burned down one of the buildings to get the land. And one of the anecdotal stories that I heard was that they were told sooner or later one of these kids is going to die if you don't sell us this land. And that's how we got Highland Mall. That's also why we have a scholarship around St. John's that we are specifically targeting toward previously incarcerated people. So all these things add up into a complete system of systemic racism. That's what we're talking about when we say systemic racism. We're talking about systems that reinforce and build on each other. And I told you I decided to get involved and decide to do something. And one of the things we've been doing, and hopefully we'll talk about, is Austin Community College applied for a grant from Kellogg's Foundation and Newman's Own, so shop at Newman's Own, buy their tomato sauce, and for a Center for Truth and Reconciliation and Racial Healing. And its goal is to affect systemic change in African people of color's lives so they're not so traumatized by the time they get to ACC. So they're not so ignored by the time they get to ACC, and so they're not so punished before they get to ACC. And we're working with 5 basic chunks. How am I doing on time? You're doing great. 5 basic chunks. One is studying the history of Austin. It's easier to talk about race when it's not so hypothetical, when it's personal, when it's local, when it's immediate. So we have to study Austin for that. And that is underlying 4 different groups. One is a family advocacy group. Now, this is different. We're not trying to teach people about how to be parents, all right? To tell you the truth, it turns out even though, I'm a numbers person if you haven't figured it out, even though an African-American child has 4 times more likely to have their child taken away from them, every study shows that black parents are as or more loving than average. So it's teaching them to advocate for themselves and teaching them to build on the strengths of their background, whether it's Hispanic, whether it's Asian, whether there's black. Each culture has its own strengths, and how to pull out those cultural strengths and realize that they are strengths. The second is a youth academy, again, to teaching kids how to talk about race. One of the things that we lost with the, I'll call it the baby boomer generation and the previous generation that said, we're kind of done with this, we've covered this race stuff, we're done, is we lost the ability to have civil conversations about race. So we need to teach those skills again, and we're going to start with kids. Culturally Responsive Teaching Institute. Talking about people of color shouldn't be a one-month kind of thing, all right? I don't know how you teach economics without talking about the economics of slavery. I don't know how you talk about American history without talking about, well, let's take economics and history together, all right? There's 3 factors of production on how a country gets to be wealthy, all right? It's capital, it's people, and what's the third? Capital, resources, and people. All right. So the resources include land. Where'd the land come? From a genocide. And we killed a whole nation, well, actually several whole nations, to get this land. All right. Resources and people. Where do we get the people? We turn them into capital. We kidnap them and enslave them. So when I hear America great, America got great from genocide and kidnapping and slavery. I'm not too up for that. All right, it's a terrible, terrible slogan, regardless of the politics, which I'll let him talk about. It's a terrible slogan if you know history, okay? So we have to talk about that, and we have to teach teachers how to talk about that, because no one taught them. All right, no one taught the teachers how to talk about race. They didn't teach them how to talk about slavery. They didn't teach them to talk about genocide, and they have to be taught. They didn't teach our teachers about, here in Austin, about the St. John's School. They didn't teach them about the 1920 laws. Those were all taught at home, parent to child, and we have to bring those stories into the classroom. And finally, we've got to work with community leaders. And when I say community, that includes schools, it includes government, and includes business. And a lot of that work is being done by, all of this work is being done by other people, by the way, except for some of the key education pieces. We're just pulling it all together so we use the same language. And that's what I'm doing. But first I had to learn to talk about race. And that's my story, so you're up.
All right, thanks. Thanks for calling me Europe.
Real quick, Dr. Casagranda. Dr. Casagranda, one sec. Hey, guys, if you're coming in now, you got to fill in the seats, because that's the benefit of people who got here early. So if not, you got to get up front. I want to see your smiling faces. That's all.
Thank you so much. All right, so there's actually a lot of stuff I want to try to cover, but we don't have enough time. So I'm just going to take a shot at a couple of them. First, before we do anything else, when we were conceiving of this panel, one of the things that we were coming up with was the name, and we ended up with America, a racist country without racist, ? So I want to sort of tease that out a little bit. And I want to start by actually talking about a case of sexism, because I think it sort of, they're related, first of all. So, I know we love to put things in categories. I was actually, on Thursday, there was this conversation I was at a panel, and there was a conversation about, one person said that racism is a tool of capitalism, and then another person pushed back and said that, no, capitalism is a tool of racism, and in my mind, the answer is yes. Yes, they are both right, and this is all interrelated, and for the record, sexism also plays a role in this. So the sexism thing is, a group of researchers divided up 3 groups of volunteers to be on a mock hiring panel. And they had the control group, which wouldn't know gender. So they would get the same exact dossiers that everybody got, but they don't know gender. And then the other 2 groups, one would know gender, but they weren't told anything. They were just told, go hire the perfect person. And then the other group, they were told specifically, you cannot consider race, you can't consider sex, but it's right there. Gender is right there on their application. And of course, the control group, it didn't, right, because you can't see gender, there was no sexism. But in the other 2 groups, of course, the group where they didn't say anything, there was a ton of sexism. In the group where they were told they could not look at gender, they did anyway. And there was just as much sexism as in the group where they weren't told anything, just for the record. So even when you know nobody's actually being hired, so it's a mock event, right? There's nothing at stake here.
You know, I was going to wait. I was just loading up.
Okay. Even when you know there's nothing at stake here, the sexism still came to the forefront, right? Did you want to jump in, Frank?
I was going to be polite and wait.
Oh,
but
okay.
I can jump in.
Okay, okay.
Because the studies, have been same studies for race. That's why, have you seen the commercial for Indeed, where they talk about different people and basically there are more and more tools because John is going to get more calls back than Juan, than Jamila, than Jane, period. Every study shows that. In fact, another point, let's take my son again. My son has a bachelor's now. His outcomes, all the ones that I mentioned before about being arrested and everything else, they are, his odds of all those bad things happening are worse than a college dropout who's white. His life expectancy is lower, his chance of being arrested, pulled over, blah, blah, blah. So it's not economics. That was a myth we tried to tease ourselves with for 5 or 10 years. It's not. So keep going.
Okay. So then what I want to invoke is implicit bias. So these researchers went to hospitals. I want to say it was 6 years ago, 7 years ago. It's been a few years. They went to these hospitals. They went into emergency rooms, and they wanted to tease out whether or not there was sexism in the way emergency room physicians treated women. And what they ended up finding out was that there really wasn't. What there was racism. Mm-hmm. And what they found out was, so there was one group of emergency room physicians who they don't know the gender and they don't know the race of the patient they're treating. It's just a piece of paper. It's just a dossier. And they just mark up what they think the treatment ought to be. And then there's another group that knows the race. And what the researchers discovered was the darker you were, the more likely it was that you would be so misdiagnosed that your likelihood of dying in the emergency room increased dramatically. So this wasn't there was a slight amount of racial bias. This was people were dying because of these decisions. Well, the researchers, when they were done, went back. They went back to the MDs and they went, look what we found. And they were blown away because one of the things they discovered was there were these grown adults, right, men and women, from different backgrounds. Some of them were white, some of them were Asian, some of them were black, some of them were Hispanic, and they're in tears, these adults with these MD behind their name, in tears going, I'm not a racist, I would never do this. And the diversity of the group was also really shocking, like what's happening here? And so, make a long story short, the research kept expanding, and what they discovered was that we have, as a society, institutionally bought into the racism to such an extent that you can take 2 small children and give them a white doll and a black doll, and you can ask the kids, you have a black child and a white child, who's the bad kid? And both the white child and the black child raise the black doll. Who's the good kid? And both the black child and the white child raise the white doll. So that it's so deeply internalized that we're not even aware of when we're acting in this racist manner. In case you're wondering, you can take the test online. There's an implicit bias test that's done by Harvard.
Harvard.
Yeah, and you can find out.
It's IAT.
That's right.
Get to the website.
Okay, he's going to get you the website. And it's brilliant because one of the things you can do is you can confront how much, and you can do this in privacy of your home. You don't have to bring it up in front of the world. A little bit after I read the study, NPR got a hold of this. And this blew my mind because I love it when I'm ahead of the study. And here.
Implicit.harvard.edu. Implicit.harvard. And it's not just
Not just race.
not just race, it's gender and religion.
And also
age
body size.
Body size, ageism, all the isms.
So the NPR followed, a medical school took this so seriously, they've made a class that's now mandatory. And I don't remember where it was, but it was on the East Coast somewhere. Yeah. And what happened was they walked into the classroom the first semester they're having this class, and they were in week like 8. And part of the class is you take the implicit bias test, and then you have to get up in front of all these other people and say your results to everybody, right? I dream of making everybody in America do this.
Yeah.
And this woman gets up and she's saying the results, and she said, so it turns out I'm deeply biased against brown people, and I'm deeply biased against Muslims. And she said, I personally find this very disturbing because I'm an Iranian and I was raised Muslim. Like the extent to which this has infiltrated into our culture is so much so that you yourself are almost certainly biased against yourself unless you're white, right? Because that's where the default setting has fallen. And we do this with the way we talk about ourselves. So white people say they're white. They don't say they're European American. When white people talk about their nationality, they don't say I'm European American, they say I'm American. But everybody else gets a label. You're African American, you're Mexican American, you're Asian American, you're Chinese American, right? You get a label. You're Native American. As if somehow being Native American made you a little bit less American than if you were just American. And it infiltrates at every level of our discourse and the way we talk. Our language is intensely racist, right? The way we perceive the color white, the way we perceive the color black. Just an obvious way in which this manifests itself. Having said all that, I want to take this one step further because as a political scientist, one of the things that I'm keenly aware of is that at the end of the day, what politics really boils down to, well, there's two things. One is an identity claim. Most of what you believe, you haven't really thought it through. You're eager to make an identity claim, and you went, oh, this ideology fits who I want to think I am, so then you latch onto it. So that's part of the equation for sure. And by the way, the nice thing about that is, in public, person doesn't necessarily know whether you're a liberal or a conservative or a Democrat or a Republican, right? You can kind of hide that in public. Whereas with race, you can't. There's not much you can do about that. Fair and Lovely, the Indians have a skin cream you can lighten your skin with. Anyway, so I forgot where I was going with this. I got distracted by the Fair and Lovely thing. Oh, okay. So just at the end of the day, what politics really boils down to is the resources that are available to run your society, to run your civilization, are limited. There just aren't enough to do everything you want to do, right? Do you want to have a bloated military that's ungodly and psychotically cruel and sadistic, or do you want to go to Mars, right? You got to pick. Yeah, you can't do both. At some point, you're going to have to decide. Kill colored people and take their resources, or go to Mars. Maybe you could kill the colored people, take their resources, and then go to Mars with those resources. Anyway, there's a limited number of resources. It's not infinite. So we have to assign them some way. Well, the richer you are, the poorer somebody else has to be. That at the end of the day, politics is who got the resources, how did they get distributed? And one of the things that's amazing about race and the way we've played race in the United States is we've intentionally made it so that the resources are generated by people of color and then unfairly distributed back to white people. Having said that, in the 1980s, we did it in a really clever way. Because so up until the 1980s, it was, some version of Jim Crow and segregation. In the 1980s, Reagan comes along and says, let's cut taxes. Let's cut taxes. So it's not just the federal government that cuts taxes. The states do it, the counties, the cities. It's a mass tax cut event from hell. The problem is Americans were thrilled to get larger paychecks now, but they didn't want their public services diminished. Well, where's that money going to come from? So the federal government debt spends and then is going to make your generation pay for it. We run out of money around 2034, 2035. At some point you're going to have to vote to increase your taxes dramatically because your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents were really irresponsible jerks who stole from your generation and saddled you with a $20 trillion debt. That was the federal government solution. But the cities and the states and the counties didn't have that as an option. So what they did at the municipal and the county level was speeding tickets, traffic violations, any kind of violation you could come up with. But really early on in the 80s, the cops realized something, that African Americans simply didn't have the resources or the knowledge to fight those violations, those tickets. And that once you got the person into the system, it was easy to sort of prey upon them because you could create sort of a debt spiral with them. And then once they were impoverished, you could even get them in jail, which, by the way, the Constitution allows for slavery in the prison system because of the way the 13th Amendment is written. And then you can exploit them even further. And so what ended up happening was, when Michael Brown was killed, to add another insane moment when a black person is killed for no reason, when Michael Brown was killed, one of the reasons why Ferguson, Missouri ended up in such an uproar wasn't just because of the death of one black guy. It was because that whole community had been preyed upon systematically through a series of sort of random attacks where people were just picked up and given traffic violations or whatever violation you could come up with just to generate capital so that the white people could still have all their services that they weren't willing to pay taxes for. And so some of this, sometimes you think you're acting out ideologically in some sort of principle like, why does the government take so much of my paycheck? But what you don't realize is that somebody still has to make that payment, that the money didn't just come from nowhere. And on that note, I want to just sort of plant that as an idea for the conversation we're going to have. On the last part I want to do is I want to personalize this a little bit, which I'm always reluctant to do. Because I'm white, and I've always been treated as white. I've never really gotten a lot of racism in my life, except when I do what I'm about to do, which is actually explain to you how unwhite I actually am. So first of all, I have this Mexican-sounding last name, Casagranda, so when people approach me, they just assume I'm a white Mexican, or it's a mystery, or maybe they ask me and I say, oh yeah, the last name is Italian, and then I just conveniently leave it at that. So I am more European than not. I am 17/32 European. I've got this down to the 30 seconds. That's how sad this is. And it's German, Italian, Finnish, and Swedish for those of you who had that burning question. But then the other 30 seconds, that's the part that makes it rough for me. So I'm actually, 12 of that is Egyptian. I am 3/8 Egyptian, and then 30 seconds is, we don't know. It's either from Iran, Turkey, Syria, or Iraq. It's sort of mystery, we don't know, genetic material. So when I said earlier that 3.5 of us who had African descent, I was actually also being overly simplistic because I know for a fact Frank is part white, and I suspect everybody at this table is part white. So one of the interesting things about
48% white.
7% Irish.
You're 70%? 7% Irish. I was going to say that was, anyway, the whole black Irish thing.
Mostly Nigerian, West African.
Okay. So,
all right, and since you went there, all right, think about that. And this is, again, making it personal, making it real. All the way back through at least my grandparents, all of them identified as black. So where did this 50% white come from?
He's half white.
I'm half white. All right, now the one-drop rule means that the one-drop rule was adopted when they were trying to figure out who was black. And the idea was if you had one single drop of African blood, you're black. So Facebook's right. You are African American.
Do I have a choice?
You don't have a choice. All right. So once you said Egypt, you were done.
I'm done because I'm.
Yeah, I mean, we like to call it Middle East because Egypt. It's cool. It has the pyramids, but it's in Africa.
It is very much in Africa, and my Egyptian family varies in color dramatically. There is a very fair-skinned redhead with freckles. My grandmother had blonde hair and green eyes, but then I have relatives. They're not quite as dark as any of the other three panelists, but they are very dark. right? And so when I go to Egypt, race is no longer an issue. It just isn't a big deal. I get hell because I don't fit the stereotype of what Egyptians think. So I get racism when I'm in Egypt. They're like, oh, you're so American. And then when I'm here, if I admit I'm actually part Arab, because I'm not just African, I'm also Arab, right? Because Egyptians are African, they're Arab. And so when I admit I'm Arab, then all of a sudden they're like, oh God, here's the Arab, right? Or they'll go, oh, cool. And I can't tell you how many times I've been introduced by a friend to another friend as, oh, here's my terrorist friend, which is always a lot of fun, just to, sort of bring it home. The N-word has been used with me, but usually there's sand in front of it, just for the record. Raghead and other epithets come with that as well. And so I've learned over the years to hide. I have learned, so I get to avoid the racism by simply ignoring the fact that I have this really amazing pharaonic pyramid building ancestry that goes back 6,500 years and that I'm way more proud of than any of my European ancestry. But at the end of the day, to talk about it, to bring it to the surface, means I'm going to catch a little bit of hell. So in that way, I'm adding a weird twist to this because there are a lot, by the way, if you are a racist, do not take 23andMe. You are gonna find out, especially if you're from the South, that you've got a lot more whatever you hate in you than you were led to believe. But so I get to play this game. I get to play this sort of race color game, which I always feel weird about and guilty about because such a huge part of my identity is African. If you've been in my office, there's only two people in my office. It's Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, and Malcolm X, right? So, I mean, you should have, oh no, sorry, there's a little Lenin thing in the side, but I don't take that seriously. So you should have known that there was something going on, and yet I'm just now outing myself. And I want to stop there. Oh, thanks.
Proud of you.
Thanks. Anyway, I want to stop there because I want to have this be more conversation-y. And we've got an hour, so this is going to be a long hour if you don't talk. And there's a mic right there. So you can just sort of walk up there. Do you want to use the mic? It's right here in the front.
It is cold in here.
No. Yes. Okay. This thing that I've recently been thinking about is, the Latinx community is sort of creating this discourse about becoming racialized. In a sense, you have the African Americans who've been sort of catching are at the forefront of catching the brunt of this sort of racism for hundreds of years, right? And then in the last sort of 50, 60 years, and you've had the Native American population. But in the last, I say 60, 70 years, there's been the Latinx community that's been added to that mix. And now you have the Muslims who've recently been added to that too. And so the Muslims have joined that, have jumped on that bandwagon and are saying, yeah, we are now becoming racialized too. And I had been picking this up a little bit, but it really hit me Thursday night at that other race panel we had last week. The African American community is pushing back against this in a sense that, okay, y'all are somehow, this isn't race. The sort of prejudice that perhaps the Latinx community or the Muslims are getting is something that's not quite as grounded in skin color, but it might be about other things. Perhaps it's a mixture, but it's really not quite the same thing. I was just wondering what y'all had to say about that. Thank you.
Let's go this way.
Cool, I'll start. That's a great question, and I'm be honest with you. I'm pretty sure my answer is definitely not the politically correct one in this regard. But being an African American that grew up around Hispanics and whose wife is Afro-Latina, you do feel that it is very different. And you feel that it is very different because there is a choice that Hispanics, and I can't really speak to Muslims because I didn't grow up around a lot of Muslims, but for Hispanics, and I bet you any African American that grew up around Hispanics can tell you this, there's a choice there if you're not a dark Hispanic, right? There were people in my classes that I swear to God I did not know were Hispanic until the roll was called. You know, like the way that they moved in our society, you know, was definitely not what you thought a Hispanic, you know, was, you know, just growing up around it. So, and they also, in a way, you know, a lot of them, at least in my neighborhood, and I can understand given the area that we grew up in, right, and trying to aspire to you know, your humanity, right, which is being denied to you because people think that, oh, well, you're from Mexico, you need to go back, yada, 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 right? There was this aspiration to whiteness that I observed so many times, right? So it's like, okay, well, where are you at, right? On one hand, you know, we being black, there's no escaping this, right? This is what we encounter, right? But now that there is heat, and I don't even think that the heat that the Hispanic community is feeling right now is a skin color thing. It's more of a difference in culture, and now people are like, hey, why are these people who are different from us taking all of this space, right? I think that's where maybe the white supremacist is coming from. But for black Americans, I know we get irritated when we hear people try to say, oh, this is what you guys went through is the same to what we're going through now. It's because it's like we've never been able to escape ours. There was no aspiration to whiteness that any of us could ever aspire to. We had to fight. We still have to. So, you know, and even in the Hispanic community, colorism is a big thing. I know that my wife for sure she's not talking to one of her aunts, because for years growing up, her aunt would have these little microaggressive comments, like whenever they would show up. Now, my wife's last name is Black. And whenever they would show up to family events, her aunt, you know, who was a fair-skinned Mexican, would always say things like, hey, here comes the Black family. You know, like what what are you trying to say, right? You're my aunt, what is this, right? Or she would say things to them whenever they were in the car going to some places like, hey, you're Mexican. All right, don't forget that, you're Mexican. You know, just kind of like, hey, you know, and my wife always felt like she had this thing where people were trying to make her choose who she could be, right? And when she confronted her aunt about this stuff, her aunt was like, hey, that's a problem that you have, right? It's the same thing you get from white supremacists. No, you're just insecure about who you are. This has nothing to do with what I'm saying to you. I have had no effect on you. You're lying on me, right? Telling the victim that they're the reason that they're the victim, right? As if you've done nothing, right? So I can tell you that I'm still trying to learn. I know watching my wife go through that, hearing, you know, her aunt say this stuff to her on speakerphone, I try to stay out of it because it's a thing between them, but hearing her say those things, it makes me wonder, you know, even for my kids, like, you know, we all imagine that we're going to get to this place one day in society where, oh, racism is fixed and yada, yada, yada. It's not about, you know, what's the best way to word this? As long as people are aspiring to whiteness, regardless of whether you're Mexican or white or a really, really light black person, right? If you're aspiring to this level of humanity that only whiteness provides, racism isn't going to go away. So whether you're from Mexico or Spain or from African American who's really like I said, as long as people are aspiring to be above everybody else because their skin is lighter, regardless of where they're from, we're gonna have these issues. But that's just from me growing up in the hood. That's my experience.
I'll let you go.
Okay, I'm gonna give two separate answers. Actually, three. The first is the training that the city of Austin is pushing forward is something called Beyond Diversity. And the way that they deal with it is forget all the nuances. It's about skin color, all right? The system was set up for black people and white people, and everybody else falls in between. And when you look at the numbers, that's how it plays out. So the outlier often is the Asian community, depending on how they and their personal histories, but in general, and Native American, which is probably the only group that gets treated worse than African Americans. But in general, it was set up for black people and white people, and everything else just happens to fall in between. And when you do the studies, yeah, it kind of backs that up. Then the whole lack of choice, and I'll take it back. Ignoring most of the African Americans in the United States are woefully aware that their ancestors did not come here by choice. Okay, there just was no choice in it. And that one distinction kind of changes the game. You know, their grandparents were kidnapped. You know, I had an epiphany one day that my great-great-grandfather, who they called Ma Story, it wasn't until I saw his grave and saw that his first name was Henry that it dawned on me that Mass was master. So, I mean, that kind of changes the game. Now, having said that, there's a whole lot of color-based discrimination within the Hispanic community, within the black community. There is regional issues within the black community. The difference, I am from the North originally, and the first time I dated a black woman from the South, it was like we were from different cultures. All right, it was completely different, even though it was still the same. The colorism within the black community, colorism within the white community, I said that. Oh, the difference between someone from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic and Mexico is huge. My fear is and I was at ACC had a Latinx conference last week that I was at, and my fear from the whole thing is that they will lose the distinctiveness of their heritage in banding together for a stronger power base. That's my only concern.
Yeah. So I guess it would have to be what these two gentlemen have basically said. Latin American individuals, they have faced their own struggles in this country. If we even look at the state of Texas, how did we get Texas? Well, we went to war, we fought, we took it. And what happened to all of those individuals that had land that was granted by them by the Spanish government? Well, they lost that land. And we could see that that struggle is something that's still going on. And that population is still growing, and they're still fighting for their same rights. So can we kind of make a difference, say that African American struggle is different than Hispanic struggle? No, it's still a struggle. They're still fighting for those same rights that all non-Anglos or whites are fighting for. And yeah, that's about what I would have to say, yeah.
One of the things I was talking with a student, and she is Asian American, and she, as an adult, has generally dated white guys, and she's now dating a Hispanic person. And her experience made me think about the issue, because she was saying it is so nice to talk to someone whose food comes out 3 orders behind the white people's orders come out, or randomly gets selected to get searched when they go through TSA. My wife was the lucky random person last time I traveled. I mean, those little things that come up in a person of color life, a lot of them are common. So yeah, that was the third thing I wanted to mention.
All right. So Benefsh and I have been talking about this a lot. So I've been thinking about it a lot, and just sort of the randomness of things coming up. I'm always reminded that I'm Arab when I'm going through airport security, because I definitely get extra attention. And this is pre 9/11. I was 16 in Germany, and I was flying, and honestly, I don't remember if I was going to Egypt or the United States, but I had 6 Lufthansa flight attendants surround my mother and me. And they asked, like, okay, where were you born? And my mom said, Egypt. I was born in Lebanon. I'm just as eligible to be president as all of you anyway, because I was born a U.S. citizen, just for the record. So I'm as eligible as McCain and Cruz, which may make me not eligible, depending on what the configuration of the Supreme Court at the time this ends up in front of them. But they asked us, right, do you have any deadly weapons? And I raised my hands, and I went, my hands, and they laughed, and they let us on the airplane. But I've constantly gotten a little bit of extra attention. I want to talk about this, though, because I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think Jewish Americans and Muslim Americans made sort of a pact with the devil really early on. And so the Jewish population in the United States actually was already in Manhattan when the British took over New Amsterdam. So there's this, and the reason is because the Brazilians had actually the Portuguese had kicked out the Jews from Brazil, and a bunch of them moved to Manhattan. That's where they ended up under the Dutch, and then so when the British took it over, so there's been a Jewish population here for a long time. In the case of the Muslim population, right, the Muslim population really started to come in the 19th century in Austin, not just the rest of the United States. Austin has had a Muslim presence, or at least an Arab presence, for about 125 years or so. 30-40% okay, right. But the twist of twists in this is when we have this conversation, we usually think Muslim, we think Arab, we think Turk, we think Persian. What we forget is that the third largest religion in the United States in the 18th century, in the 1700s, was Islam. It came right after the Baptist and Methodist faiths. And one of the major programs that the United States had was, the British first and then the United States later, was the de-Muslimification of its slave population, which was wildly successful, so much so that it went from, the third largest religion in the United States to it's about 1%, right? A little bit, maybe 2% of the United States is Muslim. It's probably about 1.5%. So here's the deal. The deal got manifest in law in the case of Arabs. So, and it's not just, so just for the record, the majority of Arab Americans, the vast majority of Arab Americans are actually Christian. How's this for a mind screw? But the vast majority of Muslim Americans are not Arab. All right, so just to push back on whatever you were thinking. 1907, a Christian Lebanese guy, wanted to become a U.S. citizen. But the way U.S. race law worked up until 1952 was until 1952, the only people who could become a naturalized U.S. citizen were whites. And by the way, at the time, U.S. race law said there was only 3 races on earth. They were Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. Like, just saying it makes you feel dirty. And this guy was from Lebanon. Lebanon's in Asia, so he was going to have to write down that his race was Mongoloid. So he sued. And it got all the way, I don't remember how far up in the court system, but at some point, the judge goes, the guy says to the judge, what color was Jesus? And the judge goes, well, he was white. And the guy goes, I'm from there. Whatever color Jesus was, that's me. And so that's when so if you look at the race thing, it says white, parentheses, including the Middle East and North Africa. That's when that got codified into law. So I have to put down white, regardless of what my identity is. That's what I have to put down. That's U.S. race law. I'm thinking of doing Martian in the 2020 census. But my point in all of this is, I think what happened with a large portion of the Muslim American population and the Arab American population is they thought, we can just assimilate and disappear in. And we'll just get away with this. And I think one of the things that's happened in the last 2 years is Muslim Americans and Jewish Americans have had a really rude awakening. The violence rates for both are through the roof. Like, they've increased by 2 to 3-fold in the last 2 years, and it's been particularly vicious. But the twist for Muslim Americans is, I think it's because Muslim Americans have had this attitude of, I can just ignore what's happening in the Middle East. It's worth pointing out that the Arab population in the world is 450 million people. So it's about it's 460 million people. It's about 1.5 times the US population. It's 1.4 times the US population. So we're talking a lot of people. In the last 25 years, 1% of that population has been murdered, almost entirely by US foreign policy. In other words, my taxpayer dollars go to kill people who are like me. I feel dirty every day of my life that happens, and yet there is no mass protest movement pushing back against this. At one point, 10% of the Arab population was displaced and forced out of, 7.5%. 7.5% of the Arab population was displaced and forced out of their homes. The Arab population accounts for 6% of the world's population, 6, but 50% of the world's refugees. The UN just said that the world's refugee crisis that we are currently experiencing now, which is over 60 million refugees, is the worst in human history. That even the crisis that World War II created wasn't this bad in terms of numbers, not in terms of percentage of the population. So interestingly enough, or at least in my mind, there is some real statistical and categorical evidence that Arabs are getting genocided on a grand scale. And yet somehow we've sort of been, oh, this isn't really affecting me. Now all of a sudden there's violence directly affecting me. And then I go, well, wait a minute, where were you in the anti-2003 protests, war protests? Where were you in the Gaza massacre protests in 2008? Where were you in solidarity with the Green Movement in Iran in 2009? Why weren't you there in the streets in solidarity with the Arab Spring in 2011? Now all of a sudden it's affecting you. I think everybody should be reacting, because now all of a sudden you care. Where were you when it was other people's lives at stake? And so I think that's maybe where some of that pushback is coming from. I know it's one where my pause comes from.
Yeah, and we probably should, or at least I should have said this earlier. Race is a construct, all right? It's a man-made construct. When I said 48% white, I should have said 48% European, all right? Because there's color that we can see of our skin that has nothing to do with anything, all right? But so we can talk about places of origin, but we have defined and redefined race in this culture multiple times based on political reasons and economic reasons, and never once for scientific reasons, because there really is no scientific base.
Well, I actually have a response to what she was saying as well. That like under racism and next to colorism, I think there is also this thing called anti-blackness that is obviously connected with all those things, but that kind of, I feel like that looks like, I used to live in Bahrain, which is right next to Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf, and I went to it like a Sephora. It was like a makeup store, and I was looking for foundation for my skin, and I couldn't find my skin color, and I couldn't find anything near anything what I could put on. And when I had asked one of the employees, I said, hey, can you help me find a foundation that's my color? And they didn't have anything past a certain olive. And she had told me that we actually don't ship anything into this region past this color, as if it's not the hottest region in the world where there's North Africans and really, really, really dark people. So it was very, out of the United States, it was just a crazy experience to have that was related to why there's pushback and all that. But I also have a question of, I'm open to more conclusions, but I've concluded that white people don't really have any reason to be an ally for black people. I think I've concluded that there's really only like a moral part of it, because nothing that they can, like, it doesn't necessarily benefit them, since they have everything. They have their rights, and they're not in the same position as we are. So how do we communicate to our white peers, our white non-peers, and how do we create allies for black people, black bodies?
Great question.
So that is an awesome question. And I remember, Dr. M, we talked about this in class, and the conclusion that I came to is very similar to yours, but it's not. It's a general conclusion about power, right? If I have every advantage, why would I ever give that up? Why would I do that? I don't care about morality. Why would I ever do that? I have the advantage, right? If I have $10 and you have $0, and you need something to eat, even if there's a morality play, I'm only going to give you enough to eat. I'm not going to give you $5. Are you high? Like, no, right? I have the advantage. I'd be dumb to give it up, right? That's the way our society is organized. And let me start by saying this, right? I believe that white people too are also victims of this system. That is, we are all victims of this system. Our responsibilities to this system, though, are very different, right? If you're a white American, you have been conditioned to believe, whether you actively believe this, right? In your subconscious, you have been conditioned to believe that you have more value in society than someone that of darker skin color. Whether your parents told you that or not, whether you actually believe that and you write that down and you post that stuff on Facebook or not, it has nothing to do with that, right? Black people are conditioned the same way to think about their own skin color, right? That's facts. Whether you like it or not, or whether it hurts your feelings or anything, that's true, right? Black people are conditioned to believe that they're are more inferior to someone of lighter skin. The same way white people are conditioned to believe that they are more superior because of their skin, right? But my answer goes back to this. I even wrote my senior thesis about this, and I don't have an answer. If I have the advantage, why would I ever give that up? Why would I ever give that up, right? Because if I feel bad, like, there's only so much morality, in my opinion, right? Please, if anybody here has an answer, please help me out. But there's only so far morality is going to get you. And to be honest, we will twist morality to fit our objectives. We will absolutely do that. I was in the military, and the things that you're talking about, it's a lot way worse in person. It's a lot way worse in person. When you're in a foreign country and you're conditioned to believe that you're going there to liberate people, and those that resist the liberation deserve to die, you have convinced yourself that the people that are resisting you have no morality, so therefore you have to eliminate them. You know what I mean? This is something that I was taught as a Marine for 5 years, right? And for the 8 months that I spent in Afghanistan, I believe that, right? And when you talk about living with shame, I went over there to Afghanistan thinking because I was American, I was superior, and everything I did was right and it was supposed to be done because that's what God has for this country, right? And then I come back and realize that I'm inferior here. What the hell was I doing, right? So I don't know. That's basically what I'm gonna tell you, you know. And you know, this isn't an attack on white people panel. Like I said, I believe white people are victims of this too. Their responsibilities are different in this system to eradicate it than, say, a dark African American or even a black woman, right? But you know, I don't know. I don't know why you would ever give up the advantage.
Well,
Yeah.
so
Dr.
let's and then okay.
Oh, I'll keep mine short. Obviously,
Because I do have some suggestions.
yes, he has a lot. All right, so I would have to say, if we look at the civil rights movement, there were a number of whites that were allies during that time period. And we would have probably never got the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act without those white allies. Most of those pieces of legislation, they weren't written by African Americans or minorities, but they were written by Anglos. To say that we don't have allies, I would have to agree, or I would have to say that I would disagree that African Americans and other minorities, we do have allies. But I think having a panel like this is important. If we continue to talk about racism and actually acknowledge that it does exist, there's a lot of people believe that we live in this colorblind society, but we don't. I think we need to have more conversations, and if we actually put the facts out there and how everybody feels, then I think we could have more groups working together and have more allies together. So that's my short opinion. I'll let Frank and everybody else, or Dr. Young.
Well, let me start with
Okay.
what you just said. You know, with the work I've been doing at ACC, and I'm also on the Mayor's Task Force for Systemic Racism and something or other, I can't remember the name, but anyway, there are as many, there are more white folks on that panel than there are blacks. So there are folks who are doing this work, and what they need is tools to talk. All right, I don't know how many of you in the audience who are white have ever been taught about how to talk about race to anybody, let alone another white person, all right, or even been given permission to start a conversation with a person of color about race. It's not something that's being taught, all right, so that's the first problem. The second is people are very local. All right? I don't know how to deal with the global issues, but what Roy was talking about with the doctors crying, the stat that really got them was about women. Black women were given half the amount of pain medicine than white women. Okay, it's because black women are viewed as strong. And white women are viewed by the doctors and society as weak, as a general statement, and it shows up in pain medicine. So they cried. When they talked to social workers about, and showed them the stats of black kids versus white kids with 237 other dimensions, socioeconomic, time in the school system, blah, blah, everything else. They had 237 different variables on the kids. The only one that matters was race. If you were black, you had 3 times more likely to get referred to the police system than the white person for the same offense. When the social workers saw that, they cried. All right? When bankers were told, bankers have always said, we can't discriminate. It's in the computer system. All right? And then you go, well, then look at the data and explain it. And they said, well, we're not discriminating against blacks. We're just helping the white people work the system. All right, if you adjust this number or pay off this credit card, if you do this and come back next month, your credit score will be up 10%, and then you'll get a better raise. Okay, so when you go system by system and say it's nothing but race, then you can find the allies to fix the system and improve their chosen area of expertise. Okay, I mean. One of the, if you really want to have some fun, look at old TV, old color TV, and look at the people of color, and I'll say people of color because I mean people of color. That's one of the things that we should be doing more of. At least I've been taught that we should do more. When we mean black, we should say black. When we mean Asian, we should say Asian. When we mean white, we should say white. When we mean people of color, we should say people of color. The film, pre-1980, all of the shades of the black people looked the same, all right? Now you look at the recent stuff, if you look at Scandal, all of a sudden you see wonderful textures and hues of black people and all of their beauty. That's because the TV cameras were tuned to a white face. Same thing with Kodak film. The test was a white face. And it wasn't until the furniture manufacturers said people can't tell the difference between walnut, chestnut, and cherry wood, that they actually started paying attention to the darker hues. So these are the systemic things that just add and add and add, okay? And the third thing, I don't know how you affect the political system, all right? Because that's the thing, because we criminalize marijuana. We fill up the jails. We make it a business, then we start decriminalizing it, but then we leave the people in jail. We have disproportionate penalties for crack cocaine versus cocaine. We throw addicts in jail until it becomes a white problem, an opioid problem, a middle America problem, and now all of a sudden they need all the things that we told everybody that worked before. They need counseling, they need treatment, all these things that were known to solve the problem for the last 50 years, we're not now starting to do, now there's not an urban black problem. All right, so we've got to look at our systems with a racial eye. And the last thing I'll say, if everybody has a reason to be proud of their heritage. I am so proud of my heritage, the people who came before me. And I think white people should be just as proud of, I'm not saying you shouldn't be proud of your heritage, I'm saying you should. You should be so proud of your heritage that you're willing to talk about it and realize, just like there are issues with my history, there are issues with everybody's history, all right? And we have to talk about that. But if we keep thinking that we can't, being proud means that we're superior. Mm-hmm. That's where it gets to be a problem. All right, we should be proud of we should look at it on a linear scale rather than a hierarchical scale, and value the differences on a linear scale.
So I'm going to add one more thing to this, and it's aimed at alliance. So while it is true that white people might not, they're not going to experience racism necessarily. Do you want me to give it to you now?
It's up to you.
Go ahead.
You're on a roll. Go for it.
Okay. So while it's true that white people might not experience racism, I guarantee you that you're experiencing sexism or you're experiencing classism. That is to say that I think racism is, so that question, back to that question, is this a question to build on what Benefsha and I have been talking about and she's been teaching me. This is a question of patriarchy, that there is this overriding thing that encompasses capitalism and sexism and racism and classism and all the other isms, and that really everybody is affected by something. There's nobody who's walking away, maybe that one, that group of 500 rich, white, heterosexual Protestant males in the United States, maybe they're not affected by anything because they're like the perfect master race. But everybody else is going to get hit by something. So if you are a victim of classism, why not ally yourself with a group of people who are a victim of racism to fight for a common cause? Why not work together? And that's exactly what happened in the 1960s. We have been here before. We have transcended these ridiculous categories, because they are ridiculous, because it's like Frank said, this is a social construct. What happened was, at some point, you or your ancestors picked some arbitrary line in the past and said, I'm not going to pay attention to anybody before this point, and that is what I am. So, your ancestors were in Germany 500 years ago, boom, you're German. But, if you can do this National Geographic thing, National Geographic does. What they do is they test to see the path that your ancestors took out of Africa. And, if you go back 5,000 years, you might find that your ancestors were actually in Turkey. And if you go back 10,000 years, you might find that they were actually in India. And you go back 20,000 years and you find that they were actually in Saudi Arabia. And you go back 50,000 years and everybody was in Kenya. And so, at the end of the day, we've all just sort of drawn a line and went, this is what I am. But it's just this arbitrary construct. So if we can somehow get past all these demarcations that we've made, these barriers between each other, we would realize that we could, as a group, fight for our common liberation. The 1956 Egyptian Constitution said, in order to break the chains that bind men, we must break the chains that bind women. That was just an open declaration of we can't liberate ourselves until we liberate everybody else.
Yeah. That's a good one. The other two tools I'd as far as getting allies, one is it turns out that if you fix racism and you fix the racist systems, you generally fix it for classism and genderism. Ageism is, we're still working on that. But generally speaking, the big step is race. And then you can make the little steps to handle everything else. But you can't go from the little things and then when you go, okay, work for gender. I'm now treating John the same as Sally. But then that leap to then fix it for race, it's too big. It hasn't worked. So, and then sooner or later, you backtread on everything. Yeah.
So this question about allies. So Austin is like the most progressive city in Texas, and an argument can be made that it's the most progressive city in the South. And the city of Austin has a lot of programs that try to advocate for like the African American community, right? But yet again, where like that community is fleeing Austin. Mm-hmm. Like so,
being driven
like
out, but go ahead.
So yeah, so like basically like that community has left Austin because like it's there's different reasons like and price is one of them. But how can the most progressive city, we can say we're the most progressive city, but like with only maybe 2 races as the majority and like, yeah.
Yeah, good question. You want me to go first this time?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Austin Community College as a metric, even though we go outside of Austin, is majority minority college already. And it will continue to be so, even with changing demographics. The first thing is, what do you call Austin? I mean, there's Austin proper, and then there's the greater Austin community, which is a subtle but important distinction. So, you know, when you start thinking about Pflugerville and where people are running to, I think those communities are still close enough. The second thing is, that's actually, there's money to be made in diversity, and that's also another tool. The power of buying and the power of being able to rent and to people of all faiths and colors is a selling point. And discrimination is bad for business. Being caught discriminating is even worse for business. I know, you hate business.
No, I was just thinking that, now Starbucks is going to behave. But remember when Denny's was caught?
Okay, so here's the thing about, and one of the, since you brought up Starbucks, you know, they're going through bias training. They're going to take that AIT test that we talked about. But at the end of the day, as Mindy Galante, she's a, Gulati rather, she's a, I believe she's Caucasian, but she's a diversity trainer here in Austin, said, yeah, it's good that they're going through bias training, but that was just straight out racism. All right, that's just a black person getting arrested for something that white people do every day. Okay, just flat out racism. Okay, sometimes racism is unintentional, but it never would have happened to a white person, not in a million years. Okay, so we find allies in the strangest place. That's all I got on that one. It's because it has to do with politics and code next, and I got nothing on politics.
I'm good. Dr. Ram, I know you had something else that you wanted to.
Oh.
Can you go to the mic?
Yeah, what you were talking about when you said, I just don't see, you know, why would someone who's in a position of power give up their power?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking about white folk or those who aspire to whiteness.
Or men.
Or men, right. This is the point I was going to make, and that is, it all depends on what we think privilege means and advantage is and self-interest is, right? In the sense that in the last 10, 15, 20 years, we have seen I mean, we're nowhere where we need to be, but since I have been in the US, I have witnessed, I came from Iran, I've witnessed a gender revolution just in the last frickin' 5, 6 years. And right? And so I am now talking to the men that I have been talking to for 10, 15, 20 years, and they are describing family advantages or family dynamics based on particular advantages, that the privileges that they were having as the husband or the father or whatever, differently. They're saying, no, in fact, when I do the dishes, when the work is more equitable, when et cetera, my life is better. So in the context of sort of gender justice, we see, okay, a redefinition of what it means to act in your self-interest if you are in a position of power and privilege. And so this is why I brought up that whole idea of solidarity. I didn't bring it up in this particular case, but I was saying, now under Trump, it seems like people of color in general, all of a sudden under attack. Okay, the Asians aren't, they're the model minority, okay, fine. But everybody else seems to be under attack. So this is sort of our moment to recognize there are more people of color who are not black recognizing their anti-blackness right now than I have ever seen. They're reading stuff. Right? This is sort of a moment where I'm on a soapbox all of a sudden, but yeah. So a redefinition of self-interest, I think. Yeah. And how through solidarity we could actually get somewhere. And not to define our interests based on particular sort of racialized groups, right? The Latinx or this, or the African American or this, the Muslims or this. We're all sort of catching the same, the advantages, the privileges somewhere else. We're only aspiring to that at the end of the day and getting away with it when we can. But the mechanism seems to be the same. It's all to extract and to, anyway. Yeah.
So that brings up, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was actually going to build on what she was saying.
So was I.
Okay, go for it.
That was going to be my closing. Actually, there's never been a better time to be in my opinion, an African American in the United States, give or take a metric or two. I mean, things have flatlined since the 2000s in terms of all the equity measurements. But 20 years ago, if two black men had gotten kicked out, arrested at Starbucks for loitering, it would not be news. It would be business as usual. At best, it would have been a who cares, all right? We're paying attention to things we never paid attention to, and that's how we create new allies. The one thing I will advise is if someone doesn't want to, some people are racist and don't like to say it, and a lot of times people aren't being allies because you're not going to win them over. Okay, so just move on. But so fixing the systems, for being the African American panel, fixing the systems for African Americans drags all the other systems and most of the other discrimination along, or makes it easier to make that step. So I do think we're having conversations, we're learning to have a conversation. It is. It will make it easier to pull gender. It's a separate problem, it's a separate dynamic, but I think Well, the same race issues are in the African-American, against African-American. It's the same thing for race. So there's as much discrimination against African-Americans within the African-American community as without. So I think that situation's the same. I agree the psychological mechanisms are different, but many of the systemic mechanisms are the same. Yeah. So if we, and that's the other thing. I'm glad you brought me back to my second point because I'd already forgotten it. The second point is your opening. You talked about scarce resources and the need to allocate and realize what's going where. And I think the biggest thing that you find out from working on diversity is it's one of the levers that diverse companies, especially gender diversity within a company, they run better, they make more money, they have a bigger pie to spread out. So it's not a zero-sum game. You fix the diversity problem, you fix the gender systems, and all of a sudden you're making more money. So even though you have a less percentage of it as a person who is used to being in the dominant position, you still have more money, all right? Because the pie gets bigger when you start being better.
Yeah. I think one thing man, I feel like the pessimist up here, man. But I have to keep it real. I think what we're seeing, yeah, I agree. Like it's the struggle that I have is nothing compared to the struggle of my grandfather or my great grandmother, or right? Like that is true. That is fact. But it is not as changed as I think we like to believe.
Oh, no.
Regardless of where you are politically, Trump showed us that, right? Like we're all like, there's no way this guy is gonna get elected talking like that about Mexicans or saying that about women or being accused of what he's been accused of. And here we are, right? And to be real with you, it looks like he might get another 4 years if this whole career thing goes down. I'm telling you, I don't see the people who voted for them. I don't see why they would not vote for him again. You take that for what you will. But when we talk about domination, like Dr. like you were saying, and I would speak from my own personal experience in my household, understanding how complicit I am in patriarchy, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, men are doing the dishes more, or they're folding clothes more, but you know what they're also doing more? They're also reminding the woman that they don't have to do that, and the fact that they did that, she should be more submissive. Right? I have to catch myself when I tell my wife, oh, well, I did the dishes last week. Like, okay, what that mean? You're supposed to. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're supposed to. So the manipulation has changed. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm talking about. The conditions, the material conditions have changed, but have the power dynamics changed?
Yeah.
And no, not at all. Not in my opinion.
I agree.
Almost have to somewhat disagree. Let's look at what happened with Bill Cosby. All right, first time he was acquitted. Now, after the Me Too movement, where we have all of these women who are coming out and talking about what happened to them being in this male-dominant situation, and now we found him guilty, and we are starting to believe Stormy Daniels. So things are changing for women. Just not African Americans, but women in general. I think women are finding their voice. They're standing up, and they are fighting against this power system. And yay, it's a good thing that you did do the dishes, okay? But of course not, because that's something that I think you should do. Or I agree. Yeah, like I grew up with my parents and my grandparents where they shared the duties. So things are changing. We still have a lot to go, but we're making those changes. And it starts by having allies, having people come together and finding that cause, that linkage together to fight and make a change in that situation.
Okay, so I'm going to add a little bit of optimism and pessimism to this at the same time. So one of the things that I think has happened is that, let me give you a weird analogy. If you had asked me 25 years ago, if people would walk around in a park with a little plastic bag to pick up their dog poop, I would have told you you're insane. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And yet now, if you find somebody who doesn't pick up the dog poop, you're like, oh, it's appalling. How could you leave your dog poop behind? So what happened there was a transition. There was like a consciousness. There was a conversation. People became woke about dog poop. And now it's just not as big a problem in parks as it used to be. The same has actually also happened, obviously, for both racism and sexism. And that's one of the reasons why we're having the conversations that we're having today, right? The fact that we're outraged about Starbucks, obviously, is because we have become more sensitive to this. And then there's also the role that our cameras are, because I don't know why we call this a phone. It's really a computer with a camera feature that sometimes you use to communicate. Anyway, like the fact that we can carry around cameras along has also allowed us to become a little bit more conscious of what we're doing in terms of violence, especially towards African Americans. But a lot of the conversation that we're having now, we already had this conversation. We had it in the 60s and the 70s. It's not to say that we haven't made some traction. We've obviously made a great deal of progress. It's just some of this we've already done before. And you were actually saying how previous generations, like, we took care of this, we don't need to do this again. One of the things that's been happening globally is there's been a backtrack on a systematic level. So if you look at democratization in the world, we're going the wrong direction. We're becoming less democratic. The United States has fallen, according to the Economist's ratings. So even the United States is going the wrong direction in terms of its democratization level. States like Hungary and Poland have all but gone completely fascist. The rise of fascism in Europe is through the roof. Poland is talking about rolling back women's rights to 19th century level rights. Hungary has become this xenophobic little neo-Nazi anti-immigrant country from hell. Like there's an extreme far right-wing party that's suddenly become pro-Muslim just to create a new type of weird neo-Nazi. And then Great Britain Brexited just because they were sick of all the immigrants that they had in their country. So it is true we've made progress, but it is also true that there are places where we're seeing extreme wrong directionalism. Not to mention the fact that Donald Trump got elected saying Mexicans are rapists and murderers, we need to do something about them, build a wall, right? I mean, he started his whole campaign tapping into that racism. If you looked at popularity ratings where they were in December of last year, he was in pretty bad shape. And then in January, he says the shithole countries comment, and his popularity ratings go through the roof, and the Democrats have plunged ever since then. And so, there is a problem here that we also need to be keenly aware of. Whether it's a reactionary thing, it's a temporary thing, or it's maybe the birth of a 1930s style trend in the wrong direction, I don't know yet, right? But there's something else here. We're going to do one more question, but we have to be brief because our time is running out. Mm-hmm. So maybe we can do your question and then kind of closing comments.
Okay.
Hi. So we've been talking a lot. I think there's a lot of pain, in the relationship between white people and black people, but I want to talk specifically about the pain in the relationships between black Americans and Africans. So I grew up, I'm first generation American. I was born here in Texas, but my first language was not English, it was Lingala. And I didn't wear, American clothing for a really long time. I wore my hair, I had antennae, and a lot of the prejudice and the mean words that I got as a kid were from black kids. And, as I grew up, I understood why. I get where those words came from. There is a lot of pain knowing that you were taken away from a place and someone else gets to experience that culture, right? But growing up and, we have Black Panther. And so it's kind of switched. Now everyone that made fun of me on the playground is ordering a daishiki on Amazon. They're all about, Erykah Badu and like that whole sort of Pan-African movement. And when I try and bring that up with my black friends, there's a lot of backlash. There's a lot of, you're just bitter. And I'm like, no, it's that same thing when, Susan or whatever gets lip injections when she used to make fun of you for your big lips when you were a kid. It's sort of that same idea, right? What was weird and foreign is now cool and trendy. Wakanda is trendy. So how do we start conversations within our own community without getting that defensiveness of, I'm not a racist, I'm not, because I think we're so used to seeing racists as white people. And so when someone that looks like you is like, hey, you made me feel pain because of how I look like and how, my culture, how do we have those conversations without anger and having it blow up? How do we have normal, just calm conversations about race?
Yeah,
Thank you.
I was hoping somebody brought that up. And it's crazy. So like this last 2 or 3 years, I've kind of really thought about that. Because I have 2 best friends, and one of them he's from Senegal. He's Senegalese, and I go to his family's house, and they're very family oriented, and but there is this kind of this disconnect, not between us, but that I noticed, right? Just being a black man from America, from the South, right? And I can't speak for maybe how Africans who immigrate here may feel. I have a view that I think that they have, right? And you can correct me on that. And I know in the black community, we absolutely feel like Africans who come here look down on us. Absolutely, it's like, yo, like, y'all were slaves. We were not. Like, it's like, that's y'all stuff, right? But there, I remember the African booty scratcher comments as a kid. I don't remember making them, but I do remember them being some things people said. I remember them being things that people said to other black people, like regardless of whether you had immigrated from Africa or not. Like, that was something like in 3rd or 4th grade, we just said to each other to like, yeah, and then run around and, as kids, right? It was just such a, and that's what I was talking about earlier when I said that, like, black people also have this problem with viewing themselves as inferior, right? And that's something that we all have to overcome. But I think, and this is just from my perspective, again, as being a black man from the South, but I think a lot of Africans who come here, now don't understand is the pain, right, that they see. They can't interpret what they're seeing with black. Like, why are they so angry? Why do they do this? Why do they do that, right? The same questions that white people have about black people, right? And the best way to describe it is when you've been through what we've been through generationally, right? And then you see, people that look like you come from another land and do great, right? Like Africans who come here do very well. My best friend, he's a lawyer. His brothers, 2 of his brothers are software engineers, right? Like very successful by American terms, right? And when I hang around them, because the Africans in Austin hang around each other all the time. Like they all know each other, but they're a very tight-knit community. And when I hang around them, man, there's no, I'm not treated different or anything like that. But I noticed that. I'm like, man, like where I'm from, like all my homies, like either, are in jail or dead or still selling weed or whatever. And I'm looking here and I'm like, man, is it us? You know what I'm saying? Like, is it black people here? Like, are we just inferior? Like, what is this? And what the problem is that there's some things that black people here in America have been through that nobody else in this country has been through. So when you see black people who are always angry, who are always defensive, who are quick to resort to the violent option, right, instead of having a discussion, it's because that's the way we were treated here. Slavery was very violent here in America, right? When I was a kid, my mom was, and one of us got in trouble, my brother's response, or my response to my brother, if knew we were going to get a spanking, is like, oh, you're going to get a whooping? How does that resemble, oh, you going to get a whipping? Right? How much does that resemble that? Right? So we're still trying to get out of this mindset of violence equals dominance. And that's why you see black people, especially black males in high school, react the way they react. Because in our homes, the way we are disciplined is through whoopings, right? So what I'm learning here is this. If you can physically whoop me or beat on me, then you are in charge of me. You can dominate me. So what happens to me whenever I get 6 foot tall and I weigh 250, and I'm looking at my teacher and I'm in ninth grade, and she telling me to sit down? Hey, bro, I only understand violence. If you can't whoop me, shut up. I'm gonna walk out of class, and that's what I did, right? So I think within it's so different, and we just gotta approach it differently, and we gotta have these discussions like we're having now. But it's a different reality, and we just gotta figure out how to overcome that.
I would have to say that distinction, it comes back from slavery, where we had fair-skinned slaves and they were treated well. They were the house slaves, and so they had much more privilege. And then we had the dark slaves, and they were out in the field and they were treated much worse. And I think that's where that stereo comes from. We still have that stereotype today. Like, if you are not this shade, then you're okay. But if you're a darker shade, then you're not okay. And that's how it's perceived in the African American community. And I want to say it's worse among African American females, where we actually make it that distinction. Remember, early in history, if you wanted to join an African American sorority, if you didn't pass the paper bag test, then you couldn't be part of that organization. And we still have that mentality today. Okay, so how do we change that mentality among ourselves, that it's okay to be all different shades of black? It's okay. And I think that's where that distinction is coming from. How do we heal all of those past injustices that has been given to us for so long? We even see it in television, where most of our light-skinned African-American females, or even light-skinned African-Americans, they are usually more successful than our dark skin. Or if you see an African-American female with their natural hair, especially if they're newscasters, they receive so many angry letters saying, like, hey, you don't fit that stereotype. That person shouldn't be on television. So I guess the thing is that we have to start to change ourselves. The African American, ourselves, we have to heal and get rid of those biases and those differences between light skin versus dark skin. Okay? And just recognize our experience as a whole.
Yeah. Just to sound like a professor for a split second here. All of this has to do with our biases, and that's how our brains work. Our brains can make connections between things that the other animals on this earth can't, all right? That's how we got to the top of the pyramid, by saying this is a mic, even though they look different, we can talk into them, and we know what it's going to do, to make those leaps between a chair and a table, and it starts early, all right? It starts with babies. They run studies on babies, and babies like other things that look like them or things that look like their parents, all right? So that's how our brains work. We just have to begin to de-poop it. We got to retrain it to go, hey, we have to almost reprogram ourselves. And I agree with you. Part of what you are seeing is colorism within the community, but part of it is, as African Americans, when we're with Africans, it's the only time we really get to be more American than someone else of color. You know, it's a strange dynamic that we're not used to, and it creates friction unnecessarily, and where there shouldn't be, because the same systems are affecting all of us, but because of and that's a moment where we go, this person may be black, but I have more, my house has more in common with Roy's house than it does maybe with your parents' house. And the foods, I have more in common here than there. And those kind of differences all of a sudden become real. And our brain will use that as a way of saying us and them. All right? And we got to start training. It's one of the earliest things we learn, and we've got to stop saying us and them and stop valuing people who are like us more than people who are not like us. And that's where it goes.
I think that was awesome. I'm going to end it there, actually. It was so awesome.
Why don't you end it with this?
Well, no, why don't you end it with that? Oh, you want me to say what the... Okay, so President Lyndon Baines Johnson once said, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. Wow. All right, thanks for coming, and I just really want to thank my panel. Let's keep the conversation going.